Writers, I am so excited to share my conversation with the incredible Jennifer Leigh Selig with you. Jennifer is an LGBTQ plus teacher, international speaker, book publisher, and the author of several books, including the Nautilus Gold Award-winning Deep Creativity. Her latest book, Deep Memoir, An Archetypal Approach to Deepen Your Story and Broaden Its Appeal, is the subject of today's show. And during our conversation, we dive deep into Jennifer's unique blend of depth psychology and storytelling and how all of her study led to her archetypal stages of transformation. And then we break it down so that you can use them to navigate the emotional terrain of writing about trauma, grief, or anything else. So grab your pen, open your heart, and get ready to hear about the deep personal wisdom Jennifer has gained over her decades-long career as both a writer and teacher, and find out why she calls memoir the writing cure. Let's get started. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Hey writers, it is Lisa Cooper Ellison here, and I am so excited to invite you to a special webinar I will be teaching on Wednesday, May 28th. It's called The Art of Reflection in Memoir. And if you've ever struggled with weaving deep personal reflection into your memoir or personal essay, this is the workshop you've been waiting for. I will guide you through practical tools to transform raw emotion into powerful storytelling, all while staying true to your voice and your experiences. This 90-minute webinar includes a transcript, workbook, and extensive Q&As, and it's just $25. That's right, it's only $25. And while the price is low, attendance is a huge investment into your writing life. So I hope you'll join me on May 28th and make your memoir not just a story, but a transformative experience for both you and your readers by signing up today at janefriedman.com or just clicking on the link in the show notes. I hope to see you there. Well, hello, Jennifer. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so excited to have you on today and to have an opportunity to talk about your book, Deep Memoir, which I have here for anyone who is watching on YouTube. Oh my gosh, this is such a great book. So let's get started.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure. And we were just talking about this. You have included so many great quotes in this book. And holy smokes, I cannot believe the number of memoirs that you quote. And they're so good. And there were so many that I was like, oh yeah, I've read this. And then I was like, ooh, wait a second. I have not read this.
That was exactly my intention, was to create a reading list for everybody. It's like, give a shout out to all these great memoirists that have really taught me about the craft, about the form, talk about their books. And at rock bottom of who I am, I'm kind of a geeky researcher, and I just love nothing more than curling up with a good memoir and my highlighter and saying I'm doing research.
Well, it definitely shows in this book, and you have created an amazing reading list for everyone. So before we get started and we talk deeply about your book, I always like to give my guests a chance to tell us a little about themselves and your work. So what would you like us to know about you and Deep Memoir?
Yeah, thank you. So I have been a lifelong reader and a writer since the time I was a child, and I started my first greeting card company. I was writing greeting cards and the school newspaper and a family newsletter, etc. And I spent the first third of my career teaching high school English. I had a degree in literature and taught high school English, so I was deeply immersed in story. And then in the second part of my career, I turned to psychology, and I got a degree in depth psychology, which we can talk about, a PhD. And I left high school teaching and moved on to teaching at the graduate level. And then in the last part of my career, this part that I'm in now, I've turned to primarily, I've left kind of institutional life, as I say, And I teach primarily memoir, and I also teach courses in longing, on vocation, on spiritual writing, etc. And it was funny. I was meeting with my financial advisor last week, and she said, what age do you plan to retire? And I just laughed. It was like, it's inconceivable. Like, it would be a punishment for me to retire, because I just love this work that I do teaching. And so this memoir writing really brings together this sweet spot for me between storytelling and psychology.
I absolutely love that. And I agree. I think my husband would love for me to retire someday. And he also has fully accepted that I probably never will. Because I think when you find your passion and you find what is truly in alignment with what your soul's purpose is, there's no need to retire. You're happy, you're doing your life's work. I also want to say that I love that you had a greeting card business when you were a kid. I had a comics business when I was about 10 years old, and it was based on, I can't remember the exact name. I think it was like the Puppy Paws Diary, and I would hand draw these little comics for people. And there was just one issue. My mom would not give me stamps. So I had promised all of these kids for a quarter I would create these, and then I would mail them to their house. That was, the big special thing. So I took it upon myself to make my own stamps. So I actually drew stamps that look like the Special Olympic stamps that they had at the time. I drew them all, I pasted them on, and I mailed those letters. They all got there. But then one friend, like their parent got charged. And that was the end of my business.
Oh, I didn't have any artistic skills, so I used Shrinky Dinks. Do you remember those?
Yes, I loved Shrinky Dinks. They were so much fun.
My company was called Genmark instead of Hallmark, so
I love that.
I made some money.
I, alas, made about, I don't know, was it about $2.50? That's probably about how much I made.
I might have known how much I made too, but it felt like a lot.
Yeah, it felt like $1 million. I mean, a quarter back then, holy smokes. You could buy a lot with that, especially if you were dealing in candy.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Well, I want to begin by talking about this career shift you had. So you worked as an English teacher, you have a background in literature. That's one of the reasons why you do so well with this. But then you have this other unique way that you look at things, and that's depth psychology. So I am fascinated by this. Can you tell us what depth psychology is and how this gives you a different lens for thinking about this?
Yeah, so depth psychology should really be called depth psychologies, because there's several branches of depth psychology, including, one of the earliest kind of founders of the field, who would be Sigmund Freud, sometimes familiar with the work of C.G. Jung, etc. So it's a psychology that basically the animating force behind it is that there is an unconscious, that we all have an unconscious. We're all partially unconscious human beings. And much of our maladies or our malaise, or we could just say our issues, come from what we're unconscious of. And the idea, the goal in depth psychology is to make the unconscious conscious in order to find some healing or some release from what we're suffering from. And so Freud talked about depth psychology as a talking cure. So, you talk yourself through your issues. But then what I got really interested in is depth psychology as a writing cure, really.
Yes.
That brought me to memoir. And I'm going to steal a line from your website, because you talked about how you work at the intersection of storytelling and healing. What I'm doing here as well is storytelling and healing, and making the unconscious patterns of our life more conscious through actually writing about them.
Yeah. And I think, writing is one of the most powerful tools that we can use. And I was actually at the Psychotherapy Networkers Conference recently, which is held in Washington, D.C., and it's where all the big wigs of psychology go. So we're all kinds of, people. Frank Anderson was there. David Kessler was there. Dan Siegelman was there. I got to sit in on all of these talks with these greats in the field. And Frank Anderson, he has written a memoir. And one thing that he said during the session that I went to, and he does a lot of work on internal family systems, was he said he has done a lot of therapy in his life, which has led to a lot of healing. He didn't realize how much healing he could actually do through writing, so that he had actually healed more over the course of writing his memoir than he did over these decades of therapy that he had done on himself. And he had done a lot of really good, hard work.
Yeah. I have some quotes in my book or people say the same thing, published memoir, say the same thing. It was better than therapy, or I got there faster than therapy, or exactly what he said. I had done decades of therapy, but this was the thing that really did the healing. And no offense to therapists, in saying that, but it does add another element. And many of my students go back to therapy when they're writing their memoirs because they need that extra support.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I actually tell people. And especially if someone's my client, I'll say, okay, I'm going to be working with you in one way. And yes, I have a background as a therapist. I worked, as a trauma therapist for a period of time. However, we are doing a certain kind of work and you are going to need some adjunct work depending on the type of story that you're working on. And so sometimes I will collaborate with therapists, or I will tell my clients, like, okay, here's what you talk about with your therapist. And this is that kind of work, because I think they can serve as an adjunct. They are not exactly the same thing, but we need a lot of support when we're doing this. And I can certainly say, as someone who writes memoir and who has done a lot of healing, I was shocked and humbled when I came to the page the first time, because I'm like, I have done this work. I have done lots and lots of this work. This is going to be very easy because I already know, shoot, I have a degree in this. And then I started doing it. And there's something about this reliving that happens when we are externalizing our stories and we're getting things on the page that allows us to see things in a different way that you can't actually see or manipulate when you are engaging in the talking cure.
Absolutely. And I talk to my students about the difference between reporting what happened to you and discovering what happened to you. That's what a lot of people come in is like, this story, this happened to me, I'm just here to write it down. And then they get shocked and sometimes disheartened to realize that there's so much more to discover about the story and discover about themselves. And I think that's why memoir writing takes, particularly when you're writing about trauma, takes far longer than anyone ever imagines to actually write the memoir, because you are still discovering things about yourself. The unconscious is coming to the surface as we're writing. And so when people say to me, I've already done all that work, are you just here to write about it? I, have to have that little internal chuckle of good luck with that. But when things come up and when people get triggered by their own story, I try to frame that as good news.
Yes.
Because what it does is it means you're freshly in it. And being freshly in it can show up on the page.
Yes.
It shows up as this aliveness on the page, like emotions are coming up that you can put on the page. All of that, it is really powerful for your writing to be able to do that. So it doesn't mean you don't need to go back to therapy or come up with some really good self-care, but it is good news when we find ourselves moved by our own writing, when we find ourselves crying over something that happened in the past.
Yeah, when it comes up, it can come out. And that is how we let things go. And when I was in graduate school, I had this wizard of a professor. He did all of this experimental stuff with us, and he was fascinating. I learned so much about how to teach experientially, as well as just from him about the concepts. And when we were talking about Freud's work and the concept of the unconscious, right? There's the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. And the preconscious is kind of this borderland where we have some understanding of something and some we don't. And we did this hypnosis guided imagery exercise, the house on the hill exercise. And so he led us through this, and we actually got into the unconscious. And some people didn't, though. They had a memory and then the memory stopped, or they fell asleep. And those people that fell asleep kind of fell asleep at the borderland, and then other people went to a different place. And I think writing allows us to get to that different place. And for a lot of people, it can be disorienting, right? So when you're in the unconscious, you're in a landscape where there is no map, and you're trying to figure out what that is. And you talked about one of the metaphors that you use, which is thinking about it like a puzzle, right? So you dump it out and then you turn the pieces over. That was something that you had said. And I think your book offers us an opportunity for thinking mindfully about how we are turning over those pieces and then what we're doing with them.
Yes. Because when you turn the puzzle pieces over, some of them, or when you dump the box, some of them come up face up, right, and others are face down. And we have to turn them over to discover what's on them. And so I find that to be a really useful metaphor there, right? You're not going to see all the pieces and know where they all go right away. There's an uncovering process.
And the subtitle for your book is An Archetypal Approach to Deepening Your Story and Broadening Its Appeal. So we're going to go into some of these archetypal approaches, but before we get there, because not everybody knows what that word means, could you share with us what an archetype actually is?
Yes, very simply put, it's just a universal pattern in the psyche, the software human beings come loaded with when we come into life. It's patterns that all humans across all times and cultures understand. We can think about archetypal characters, the villain, like the hero, like the orphan. We can think about archetypal values, like love and power and courage. We can think about archetypal themes, like the hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the battle between good and evil, etc. So these are universal patterns, but they're flavored differently.
Yes.
So if you think about the battle between good and evil, we can see that playing out right now, let's say on the collective. So right now in politics, there seems to be this kind of battle between good and evil. Now, one side thinks they're the good side and the other side is the evil, and the other side thinks,
Right.
Vice versa, right? But we all understand what we're doing. We dress good and evil differently, or we address them differently, or we imagine them differently. So there's both a universal element in archetypes, but then there's the personal element or the particular element. And so what I'm arguing for in this book is that to make our memoirs most satisfying to a reader, to connect the most with the reader, we need to understand the universal patterns that are inside of our story as well as the particular patterns. A lot of people already know this, but a lot of people come in just to tell their very personal story and they don't see what's in it for the reader to hear this story, right? What are they going to get about it? How are they going to resonate with it? And so to resonate with something, we want to look for the more universal. And so I'm thinking about, just last night I taught Joan Didion's memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking, the memoir about the sudden death of her husband and the year she spent grieving him. And it is so full of particulars.
Yeah.
I mean, Joan Didion had an amazing life. And no one has a life like hers. No one can open that up and think, oh, yes, I was at that hospital at that time, or I met those people. It's a very specific life. And yet there's something very universal about the grief that she's going through, the process of grief that she's going through. And all the places where I highlight in that book, it's all the places that are universal that I resonate with personally in my own journeys through grief. And that book is perennially popular, even though it's 20 years old, because if we know someone who's going through grief, a lot of times, we'll buy that book for them and give it to them, not because we want them to learn anything about Joan Didion's life, right? But we want to say, this is how someone struggled in this year. We want to normalize it in some way, or using the language of archetypes, we want to universalize it. That's the thread I want to help my students pull through their work, is to really find the universal.
Yeah, and I think the universal is so important. And I often talk about the universal as the me too, right? When you have described this well, when a reader engages with your work, they go, oh yeah, me too. This is the experience that I'm having. And I think one of the particulars in Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, that I happen to love that book as a person who has experienced deep grief. Like, most people are not going to the Merck manual, which is a manual about medical devices to make meaning from their experience. But the idea that I am feeling so guilty about what happened that I'm going to look in all of these unusual places for an answer to this problem or a way to relieve this guilt is something we can all think about, or we can all, connect with. And I think that's really important. And I'm curious to know your experience. I'm going to share just what I observe in a lot of writers, is that early in the process, someone will have had a big experience, right? Sometimes they have experienced something that is really painful. They want their pain to mean something. Or perhaps they have healed in some amazing way, right? They have had an incredible healing. And when you ask them, okay, so why are you writing this book? It's always, well, I want to help people, which is general, right? So that's a general thing. And I want to help them by telling them exactly what I did, which may be part of the process. That's a reportage of what happened. But then, we do have to do that. That is part of the process. But then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, what's going on with your reader? How does your reader handle these things? What are their struggles? And how can you toggle between your experience and crafting your experience so specifically that it serves as a mirror for something that someone else is going through.
Yes, it was wonderful. And a lot of times you don't know what that is.
Right.
You don't know exactly when you're starting to write your story, where's the medicine in your own story? Where's the wisdom in your own story? And to name that and to claim that is sometimes comes later on in the writing process. Sometimes we just need to almost like purge the memories themselves before we can
Yes.
dive deeper into what does this actually mean and how is this story going to serve someone else?
And that leads to the big thing we are going to dive into, which is these stages in the writing process, which I found to be so fascinating the way you put them together, and the archetypes of transformation. Both of those things are aspects of the writing process that writers tend to struggle with, because no matter how many times you say, okay, well, how have you transformed? Or how have you changed? You may or may not know, or you may have to wrestle through that as you're writing your book, but having some patterns of going like, oh, this is the normal trajectory of what people go through. And these are the general kinds of change that happen can help you understand the specific change that you've gone through. So could we start by talking about those 3 stages that you talk about in that transformation process?
Yeah, so I have a chapter in the book called The Archetype of Transformation, and I use alchemy as a metaphor in there. And alchemy is just this ancient science where these kind of mad scientists tried to turn base materials like lead into gold. And, that was unsuccessful, obviously, but it's become a metaphor for transformation, and particularly transformation of the dark material in our lives, the dark experiences, into the light. So we can think about it that way. And there's a lot of stages of alchemy in different books and different thinkers, but they really boil down to 3 that I think are most useful. And so the first stage is called the Negredo, and that's Latin for black. And that is when we enter into, what I call the underworld.
Yes.
That's when we experience trauma of some sort. And that trauma can be a slow descent. When you think about like someone who experiences addiction, what starts with, I have back pain and I'm taking some pills and they help. And then months later, it becomes a need, and then it spirals out of control. So sort of a slow descent into the underworld. Or it can be something sudden, a sudden drop, like Joan Didion experienced when she's sitting down for dinner with her husband and he is dead a few minutes later. That's the Negredo stage. And then, we spend however much time we spend in the underworld. Like Joan Didion, it was a year, and we know she did not get out of the underworld at the end of the year, but things lightened up for her as she was writing the book. And some people don't make it out of the underworld. Some people, die in the underworld, unfortunately. If we make it out, the second stage is the belief that we can make it out, really. It's called the albedo, which is the term for white. And in that stage, it's almost like if you imagine that you're at the bottom of a well and your head's hung low and you're looking down and all you can see is the darkness of the floor. But in the albedo, we start to pull our heads up and we can see maybe light on the walls, or we can pull our head all the way up and we can see the sunshine coming in. And that's when we use the term, I saw the light. We begin to see the light, and we imagine that there could be healing and there could be a way out of this dark well that we're in. And that might be, we find a therapist, or we enter a 12-step program, or, we confide in a friend what we're going through. And then the third stage is called the rubedo, which is Latin for red, which is a quickening of our blood. That's when we really feel the life force entering back in again. You can imagine at that point, we're out of the well, we're in the sunshine, and we're transformed by our experience. We feel healed, or we feel more whole. We definitely feel transformed. We may still carry our sadness and our grief and our loss, but life goes on. We're able to go on. And so for people who are writing trauma narratives, they've all been through those stages. You have to be in the light enough to be willing to take a look at your story in the light and write about it. So I talk about those stages of the trauma, and it's helpful for people who are writing to think, well, what was happening for me when I was in the Negredo? Or what brought me out? What happened in the albedo? What was the light? When we're writing about trauma, a lot of times we re-enter the Negredo. We become re-traumatized. Our trauma is up. It's in our faces. And I quote, many memoirs to talk about that. And many people, I don't know if you've seen this in your work as a writing coach, but many people stop writing at that time. They're like, it's just too painful. I don't want to go back there again, right? and it's confusing, and they feel lost in their own story and they don't know where to go. And then if they stay with it at some point, there is some light. It's like the aha, like, okay, I can write about this. Maybe I found a structure that I could write about, or I get enough of the memories out that I see I can shape this into a story. And then the rubedo comes, the third stage, where maybe we've reached the end of the story, and again, it becomes very healing to have written this story for us. We have something in our hands that memorializes our time in the underworld, and hopefully there's some lightness that comes with that as well.
Yeah, I love that framework. And as I was thinking about it, just to make it really concrete for writers, because I do think people do get stuck in the Negredo a lot of times. And I think, you can even publish a book and still be in the Negredo, right? If you haven't done all of the work. I mean, I do think that happens sometimes. In general, your first few drafts, where you're having a lot of those feelings, I would say that's usually Negredo. Like if you're wondering how can I label this emotionally, that's generally what I observe. And then in terms of albedo, it's like, oh, suddenly this isn't my story, it's a story. And I can manipulate it, right? And I can really go to those places where I can do that perspective taking. Because I think early on, especially if you're dealing with a trauma narrative where you have been victimized, it is difficult to take on another character's perspective and really understand what are all of the ways we could look at this situation. It's like, no, I'm hurt. I'm a victim. And we need to be able to embrace those things and see that part of self in order to see the story in different ways. So it's a useful piece, but I think once we get to that place where we have more distance, that's where we get to. And then when we get towards the end, when we're publishing the book, it seems like that's more where the rubello comes in. I wrote down a note when I was reading your book. I was like, rubello is more like that integration. And I thought about it in terms of like the Hegelian dialectic, to be all fancy for a moment, thesis, antithesis, and then
Synthesis.
Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Try to say that 3 times fast. But it made me think about that same way of thinking about it, and that each part is important in order to get to that place of integration.
Right. I had to work with a student once who started writing his story about his really difficult grandmother, and he was very much a victim of his grandmother in all the early drafts. And then he started to see her in a different light. We can go back to that second stage of alchemy. By the time he was done writing about her, he said, I have a brand new grandmother.
Yes.
Right? He had a new grandmother. It wasn't the one that his cohort and I had been seeing on the page all along. It was someone who was much more complex and nuanced. And he was no longer a victim in that same sense that he was. And certainly these things still had happened to him, but he understood it differently. And if you stick with the writing process, that is the promise on the other side that is so beautiful.
Yes. There are so many ways that our lives are different, and the lives of the people that populate our books, at least in our own minds, are different. We see the world in a different way, and that has ripple effects everywhere. And I think that's one of the beautiful alchemies of the work that we do. And part of that is not just understanding what those stages are, but understanding how change happens in the storytelling process and also just in our lives. And I think that's another piece that you have, these equations around transformation, I thought was really brilliant. So could you share a little about that?
Yeah, I take these from the work of Louise DeSalvo in Writing to Heal, and the work of Penny Baker and Smith in their Opening Up by Writing It Down.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I take this from their books. So I have these 4 equations of transformation, and which I've discovered all over in the memoirs that I read, particularly the trauma narratives. So the first one is secrets plus confession equals catharsis. So we take something that's happened to us and we haven't told anyone before. We've told very few people, and we write that down. We confess to the page, we confess to our fellow writers, and then eventually to our readers, and that equals some sort of catharsis. And we know that's a pattern, just in looking at 12-step programs where the idea is you're only as sick as your secrets. And you come in and you're confessing your story. You're telling your story of addiction. You're confessing, and then there's a feeling of catharsis that happens inside of that. So that's the first equation. And I give examples from published memoirs in the book about authors who say, this did happen to me. And the second one is that your story plus reflection equals transformation. That comes when we not just tell the story of what happened to us, but we really reflect upon it. We think about it, we wonder about it. We're not just writing about what happened, but maybe why it happened or how it happened or what part we played in what happened, why someone did the things that they did to us. So reflecting on our story or on the nature of the experience we were going through. So reflecting on the nature of grief or reflecting on the falling in love or anything. And in that reflection, we come to understand our stories in a different way, in a deeper way. And that reflection is such a gift to the reader who may be going through the same thing themselves. And then the third equation is an interesting one. It's story plus organization equals transformation. So a lot of times what happens to us, and you know this so well as a trauma-informed coach, a lot of times what happens to us when we experience trauma is that it's completely chaotic.
Yes.
We can't make sense of it. But when we go to write, we have to make sense. It's one word in front of another. We organize our stories or we organize what happens to us in a way that helps us to shape our experience and to really make sense of it. We turn what's muddled into some sort of a narrative arc. And so that one's really interesting. And then the fourth one is that story plus externalization equals transformation. And so once we take what's inside of us and we externalize it, it's not that it's not still in us, but it becomes words on a page. It becomes a book on our shelves. It becomes a living testament to a person that we love or that we miss. It's almost like a way of freeing us up, freeing up some bandwidth within us because we don't have to keep ruminating on our story over and over and over again because it lives over there.
Yes.
Right? That's transformative. And so many authors have said that. It's really hard for me to have published the book because every time I read a new memoir, I'm like, that's another example of it. Start to see those examples. And if you listen to, as I do, podcasts about memoirs, in the podcast I listen to that you do, I hear examples of that all the time. The importance of confessing, the importance of organizing, the importance of reflecting, and the importance of externalizing those things that happen to us. And in that way, that's why it's called the writing cure, right?
Yeah. And I think all of those stages and those ways of thinking about it are really important. I am curious to know about the concept of catharsis, because I think catharsis has a thorny way of being looked at in memoir, right? I've read essays, and in fact, I will add one to the show notes for this episode about how catharsis isn't enough. And I tend to agree. And the reason I want to talk with you about it just briefly is just because I think there are many people who think, well, if I just get it out and get it on the page and I have a feeling experience, that is enough. When we think about Pennebaker's work or, some of the other works, it's about writing to heal and it's about personal writing. It's not necessarily about published public writing, that those are two different things sometimes. And that catharsis is the act of experiencing an emotion, letting an emotional bloodletting, let's say, but that if we don't make meaning, if we stop just at catharsis and we do not do this other part of the work, we will not reap the benefits of the process.
Exactly. And I'm sure as a writing coach, you see that on the page all the time where you're like, oh, okay, that was a reporting of what happened. It's not dropping deep into the experience. There's not a sort of reflection on it. It's like, you can kind of use the metaphor of the mirror, that the author is talking to a blank wall and not seeing themselves or their experience in a mirror. And Pennebaker and Smith, in their research on writing to heal, that was what they discovered, was that people would write for 10 or 15 minutes about something that happened to them, and they had a control group that just wrote the details, and then they had another group who reflected upon the experience. And the ones who healed were the ones who reflected on it. The other ones, there was really no change in them. So reflection is incredibly important. And a lot of times when I read memoir pages of my students, I'll want to stop them and say, wait. What did you think when he said that? Or how did you feel inside of that experience? Or what do you think was going on in this experience? And that's where I'm kind of pushing them to make deeper meaning. And so it's those moments, when you're sitting with a friend and talking with them over a meal and they're telling a story and you want to stop them and understand how they understand the story that they're telling. And that's really critical to what I would call a deep memoir versus shallow memoir in some ways.
And in order to do that work, you have to get out of the negredo. You have to be able to look at the light and shine the light on all the pieces of the story that you aren't aware of or that are still unconscious for you. And I think that is some of the challenge of memoir, but it can also be some of the fun of memoir is that you get to see things in a new way. And when you do, you will feel in a new way. Now, well, does that mean that everything is going to be all better and you get to tie a bow on that? No, not in the least. However, but you get to have a new version of your life. And just like you said about your student, he has a new grandma. We can have
Yeah,
new versions of everyone, and that is amazing.
right. New version of himself, new version of his grandmother, for sure. That's magical. It's alchemical. It's the process.
It is. And what I can say for myself is that I feel it when it happens. And I have felt that alchemy. And that is one of the things that makes me so passionate about the work that I do. So, oh my gosh, there are so many different ways that we could talk about your book. And I really want people to buy it because there are so many rabbit holes and just different examples you have about ways that we can use archetypes as a way to think about our books. But we're going to step away from that for a moment, a little bit. Now, I don't know where it's going to take us as we begin to wrap up, but I am training to be an Akashic Records reader, which is just tapping into other forms of wisdom. As I get ready to do these interviews, obviously I'm reading your book, I'm learning more about you, and then I'm just thinking and connecting in with this deeper wisdom to say, okay, what else should I ask about? And this isn't something that I shared with you in advance. So we're just going to see where it takes us. What kept coming up for me was flowers. And I don't know why, but it was just like flowers, flowers, flowers. And I'm wondering, when you think about flowers in your own life, where does that take you? And how does that relate to storytelling?
Hmm. I think I'm going to tell you a story.
I love stories.
When I was 40 years old, I quit my job and I planned to travel across the country, going to all sorts of national parks and thinking about what I wanted to do with the next part of my life. And I went to Montana. I was at a park in Montana, and I'm also a photographer. So I was walking around with my camera and I saw this kind of a grove or a field. I think more I'd call it a grove of these really beautiful little yellow flowers. And I thought about Georgia O'Keeffe. And Georgia O'Keeffe, she painted so many flowers, and she painted huge flowers, and she painted them close up. And she said the reason why she painted them so big was that nobody pays attention to a flower. It's just too small. So she wanted to create, it's a great quote, she wanted to create these huge images of flowers that were so big that even busy New Yorkers couldn't help but see the flowers. So I got down on my hands and knees and I took pictures of these flowers close up. And I started to see that each flower had its own personality. The shape of it, its body movement, whether it was spreading its leaves out, its arms out, or whether it was, some of them were entangled with each other. And so I started to think about them as hearts. I named them. I was like, this is a shy heart. This is an open heart, a betrayed heart. And every day for the time I was there, I went back to look at those same flowers and see how they were growing and changing and really paying attention to them. And in doing so, I was really paying attention to my own heart too. I'm projecting onto the flowers, but I'm also reading the flowers and what they have to share. And each one became different, even though there was a whole grove of them. And so I've written about this a little bit in an essay on my website if anyone's interested. But it was magical for me to pay attention to each individual flower as it was presenting itself and not just say, they turned out to be arnica, Montanas. And so to not just say, oh, that's a field of arnicas, but they were individual ones. It's definitely how I approach teaching, is seeing each of my students as this kind of individual flower or manifestation of heart. But the universal is that they were all arnica Montanas.
Yes.
But the particular was the way each one manifested itself in the world. So that's how I would answer that question.
That is a magnificent answer. I love it. And we're going to link to that essay. I want everyone to be able to read that as well, because that is just, oh my gosh, my heart is so full hearing it. And just, it's such a wonderful way to think about the work we do and the work each person does as a writer. You are looking at your own blooming.
Right. and your own manifestation of something. So I'll say one more thing about that, which is people oftentimes will ask me, memoirs will say, I don't know, does the world really need another grief narrative or another trauma story or another coming of age story? Which is like saying, does the world really need another Arnica Montana to bloom? We already have one, so we don't need another one or second one or a third one or a whole field of them. And so that's oftentimes my answer. I usually give the metaphor of a love song. We're not done with love songs just
Right.
because so many of them have been written. We will be writing love songs forever. So too, take courage and take heart in writing your own memoir. We need another love song. We need another flower in the field.
Yes. So, writers, keep writing your version of your love song, of your trauma song, whatever the song is. We need your song. And so, please, please keep working on that. And I think your book is going to be a great way for people to do that. And so, if people want to get a copy of Deep Memoir and they want to connect with you, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Yeah, the book is available wherever books are sold. And I have a website. It's my full name, jenniferleeselig.com. You can connect with me there. You can find out about the courses I'm teaching in memoir coming up, some of my other writings. And you can also sign up for my newsletter. So right now I don't have any new courses coming up, but if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll be the first to hear when I'm teaching something new again.
Well, that will also be in the show notes. So, writers, please connect with Jennifer, buy her book, and most importantly, review it, because that is how other people find our books. And it is one of the most important gifts that you can give to an author. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for being on the show today. It has been an absolute delight.
For me too. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much for listening. If you want to learn more about Jennifer and, most importantly, buy a copy of Deep Memoir, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the answer to the following question. What stage of the writing process are you currently in? The Negredo, Albedo, or Rubedo? I'd love to know your thoughts and where you are on your writing journey. And speaking of your thoughts on the podcast, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Kaylee Tron, Laura Lee, Jesse Valentine, Maria Heatherton, Lisa Rizzo, Michelle Electable, Michael Nornis, and Krista Hillhouse for your outpouring of support for my recent episode with Allison Landa. It was so wonderful to hear from you and to see how much this episode touched you. And listeners, if you haven't contacted the show, I'd love to hear from you too. Until next time, remember that your story matters. And as you work on it, you change lives, especially your own. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight-proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.